Okay, so now that you have some exposure to writing async await and also how to do try catch, let's go back and do something that he didn't do that I think would be helpful to do. That he might do on the next one. I'm trying to remember, but either way, it's just good experience to have. Okay, so let's implement the try catch into the weather fetch, and then we'll start looking at the API documentation. But before I have you do a code challenge, make sure you commit. I'll come back and do this, or I'll try and catch it when I do. Did you get that joke? Okay. So here's some of the code we already wrote. This all, and remember, I like it. I like to see that you wrote it all, so comment out. And I know he jumps around a bit on that one. But in this case, here's the function, the async function, right? And we have to pair the await. You know, this function has to be async in order for that to work. So this code works as intended right now. We know we're getting, in this case, I'm console logging that. So let's rewrite this in the way that he's saying, and it really makes sense, is to try. So what are we going to try? And then what are we going to catch? And I'll just put an E here for error. Okay, so what are we going to try and what are we going to catch? Well, we're going to try this, right? We know we're going to try that. And then we know that when the result comes back, that we have to convert it. Okay, and that's because of the way fetch works. Now again, we're going to work on fetch on the next code along on this week. Okay, so now that we have the result, right, then we'd console log it. But I really like what he did, and I'm going to come down here. I'm going to grab these on success. Okay, I'm going to put them here. Okay, so now let's modify them for our use, right? So on success, what would we do? On success, we would call it, and then we would pass in result. Okay, and then here, we could call it whatever we want. We could keep it result for now, and then just console log it. Now, in this case, right, we would need to actually do what? We'd actually need, in this case, to pass this whole reference. Now, that's what we're going to talk about next, but I was just showing you first, right, when we're passing that in, we have to pass in the result.property, which is, this is the part that I think is worth talking about with the API in a second. So we make the fetch call, we await for it to come back. When the data comes back, then we call .json on it so we can review it. We get the result from that. And then we have a result that we reference to get the short forecast. So what do we do on error? As we call on error. And we pass it the E, right? And if I'm consistent, okay, still works the way it's intended. But it's much cleaner. I think I agree with him in this sense, right? So you're writing what feels like synchronous code, but it's asynchronous, really. Okay. So once you get this implemented, right, going back to the instruction, then commit with, you know, the try catch and the API call. All right, so do that commit. And now let's move on to talking about this actual API call, because it's a fun one to look at. So one thing I would start with is I would copy this, because when you saw him do it in the video, it's worth talking about. Go to a new tab and paste it. And this is the results of what that call, and this is called an endpoint. Okay, so this is the endpoint. And when the computer, in this case the browser, but also in your code, goes to this endpoint, this is what gets sent back. This is what takes a little bit of time. So it says, go to this location, bring back to me all of this data. Okay? And now, as the developer, you have to figure out first, well, when it comes back, And actually what's happening here is the browser is actually parsing it, doing the JSON for you by just the nature of the browser. But when we're writing this in code, we actually have to do this part. And then the results is all the data in here. Okay, so first know that. So when he references properties, you go down, here's properties, and then within properties, there's periods, and so here's periods. Now look at the structure, right? So what we have is, in this case, where we've been doing an array of objects, this is an object with arrays inside, which those arrays have objects inside. So the way we've been seeing it is more of an array of objects, but you can see it multiple ways as far as the data structure goes. Okay, so continuing down here, right? So we go periods, so then we go periods here, and what's in here is an array. So that's why we need to go, and in the case the 1 would be what? Right, so this would be the first entry, which would be 0. So we'd go down here, right? Okay, so 1 would be there, and then we would do short forecast. We would look for short forecast, and that's how we find that. Okay? So first is just understanding when we make API calls, and again, we're going to learn about that a little more in a minute because we're going to go over the other video. But it is worth taking a minute here to look at this and realize what it's doing and know how this, why he used this is because of making that API call. Now, the question is, can we figure out how to do this for Fresno? And maybe what city is he from? That would be a fun one. So one place you could start is you could look at weather.gov. Like I would take weather.gov and I'd come over to a new tab, I'd paste it in, and I'd like, oh, okay, National Weather Service. This is NOAA. This is, you know, the government's forecast system. The most commonly one, most all of the weather stuff that you get comes from here. Like this is the keeper, I think, of the data. Then it's used by other apps. Not everyone, but most of them. So now I'd look through here and I would try to find an API reference but this is public facing, so they're not going to necessarily make it easy. Like if I went into about, does it show? Yeah, I don't even see that. This is more just the public facing information. Maybe forecasting and services. But what I would do is rather than to do that, here's what I would do. I'd just go to, and I would search for API weather gov. And then look what I find, which is the API web service. That's awesome, right? I'm sure it was linked somewhere on that site, but in this case, I'm like, oh, this is so much easier. So now here's the API itself, okay? There's pricing, but for the most part, it's only if you're doing so many, and it is very common to also need an API key, but you don't even need that here. But if you scroll through here, you start to see some of the features, right? Let's go back up a little bit, sorry. All right, operations, pricing, worldwide consortium, the API GitHub site, that's awesome, right? So now let's look at examples, right? So when we look at examples here, we can start to see what they're talking about with these, when we're looking at this right here, 3535. So what we know is it's the office, the grid X, the grid Y, and then the forecast. That's right. So what we can do here is we could actually find, right, to obtain the grid forecast, what we would do here is we could look up Latin long, and it should return us back what we would need to get the weather for Fresno. So to get the weather for Fresno, or not the weather, to get the Latin long for Fresno, you could do Fresno latitude and longitude. Longitude, there we go. City of Fresno. There it is. Really cool. Okay, now notice the longitude has a negative, right? It doesn't show it here. So latitude, longitude. So that's your challenge. I want you to see if you can figure out how to modify this code to not only point to Fresno, but also to show temperature on the console using this structure that we've created. Okay? So give it a try. I've given you some really good hints. And then once you have attempted it, you say my code for the API challenge, and then I'll come back around and show you how I solved it. All right.